I'm honored to introduce them as guests. I've admired their work for a very long time, even though they're still 29 years old. And first we have Mary Lucier, pioneer video artist. Lucier has been known for her contributions to the form of multi-monitor, multi-channel video installation since the early 1970s. Her video work has been shown internationally and can be found in the collections of the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Reina Sofia, the Stedelijk Museum, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She has recently been involved in reviving and revising select older works for a contemporary context. A recent installation of Color Phantoms with Automatic Writing, 1972 to 2015, with the late Robert Ashley was shown at the Kitchen in 2016. And Equinox, originally made in 1979 and revised in 2016, at the List Center at MIT and at Sculpture Center in an exhibition called Before Projection, Video Sculpture 1974 to 1975. Then we have Barbara London, who I'm honored to have here today. She is a New York-based curator and writer who founded the Video Media Exhibition and Collections Program at the Museum of Modern Art, where she worked between 1973 and 2013. You all must read Barbara London's new book, Video Art, The First 50 Years, which you can get at FIDA. It's a wonderful book and essential for anybody interested in contemporary art. And also look for our exhibition, which is coming in probably 2024, called Seeing Sound, which she's doing with Independent Curators International. London has won many awards and fellowship. She teaches in the Sound Art Department at Columbia University and previously taught in the Graduate Art Department at Yale from 2014 to 2019. She is currently developing a new podcast series that features her conversations with artists, and we'll all have to look out for that. All right. Our first question today is, how are you guys doing in isolation, and has the COVID virus made an impact on you in any way?
So it's been, of course, very strange, but it's been a time for reflection and a time to really sit and do work that I can do without distraction. So actually, in the last 2 months, I wrote one catalog essay, one magazine text, and I've been developing the podcast series. So it's given me a lot of opportunity to think back on my career, which of course the book I just wrote did, but now to really think forward. So it's a very crazy time, and I think it's a time for pulling up the socks and thinking very creatively about how to move forward. So I have found it to be quite stimulating anyway.
Interesting.
So I share some of Barbara's sentiments and some of her experience. I have experienced the death of at least 3 friends who are not here where I am, but who are in Manhattan or Queens or elsewhere. And that's been very hard. I have to say that that's the worst aspect of this whole thing. My own seclusion is a pleasure. I'm in the place I love most, here in the Lower Catskills in Sullivan County. I have a wonderful studio and I really enjoy being here. My emphasis has been in the past 2 years, or at least the past year, and not just now, on my archiving. And what this period is enabling me to do is to take that long look backwards and to try to utilize what I have done over the past years, and, very many years, and to try to, as Barbara says, to look forward and to see what can come now, what I can do based on what I have done in the past and what this experience is giving me in terms of one of the topics that interests me most, which is end-of-life issues.
Well, Barbara, I read your book. I really enjoyed it. And one thing about it that was really interesting is it's also sort of a memoir where you place yourself right at the place where you were in your life, parallel to the discovery of the artworks you saw. And I was really curious. You deal with this in your book, but I would like you to share with us today. When did you first recognize something as video art rather than experimental film or sculpture, or what was your first encounter?
So I was very fortunate, and I'm happy. I think Stuart Comer is on in the audience today, who is the media curator and a great curator at MoMA right now. But when I started, the museum was very, very small. Art field was also very small. And colleagues like Kathy Ray Huffman, who's also in the audience, there were, David Ross was up at the Everson Museum, but there were a few of us out in the field who saw this wide open field and recognized the energy, and it was very alluring. So I have to say it was probably around 1973 that I first sort of made a beeline for this. And it's also in the book that I was at MoMA, and I was actually in the Department of Prints and Illustrated Books and started the artist book collection. So to me, what artists were doing with the very cheap $2 book, like by Vito Conchi or Ed Ruscha, or Martha Rossler did several in the 70s, these were works meant to get out to people, and they were inexpensive. So I think some of the early video was made in that kind of grassroots. We're going counter to television. We don't like the big monolithic. We are articulating a very private or a very individual voice. And that's what I really was looking at and looking for. And I have to say that in the beginning, similar to now, the importance of networks were just phenomenal. So I really had a very open door policy. I really wanted to learn from artists and wanted to gather that information, or wanted to see the work, wanted to talk with them, wanted to spend time with them. So and I think that's sort of like what's happening now. We're digging deep into our souls to move forward. And I think that was that moment in the early 70s, where in New York, I hope we don't go through a bankruptcy like New York was bankrupt then. But you know, it was a crazy time and a very lively time of artists crossing disciplines, collaborating. So that energy drew me in.
Thank you, Barbara. Mary, how was it for you to show video work in the 70s?
Well, I came to video out of literature and performance and sculpture. And I tried to put all of those things together to make a kind of sculpture, a kind of art that could be a public art and yet use the television technology and be sculpture at the same time, but not be television. And that was a very important distinction at that time. There were, and this was, I don't know, I made my first installation in maybe 1972. I made my first videotape in 1971. And I had already been making art since 69. So when I came into video, it was, first of all, it felt free. It felt free to women. It didn't have the baggage of art history that a lot of, let's say, painting has. And it was fresh, and life was cheap in New York, believe it or not. In the early 70s, my apartment cost $125 a month. No kidding, right? You know, I got a CAPS grant for $3,000 and I lived on that for 2 years. So it was a remarkable time when we were in this medium, we were able to move forward with new ideas. It was very experimental. And the other thing that's so crucial about it is that we were able to do these things in public. I mean, there were the wonderful not-for-profit art organizations, the small ones, like the Kitchen, like Artist Space. And then, surprisingly, the museums, MoMA and the Whitney, all were funded by the National Endowment for the Arts and the New York State Council on the Arts. And we as individual artists were also funded by them. So we had an incredible start. We had a great beginning with wonderful support, and at the same time, a very freewheeling atmosphere where we could do just about anything that crossed our minds, as many of us did. You look at Joan Jonas's early work, it's very experimental. Vito Acconci is all very experimental. And so it was a wonderful time to plug in to this new medium that had also new values.
I have to give a little anecdote about the New York State Council on the Arts. They did not give money to MoMA early on. They wanted to see that MoMA would make a commitment. And it was the National Endowment for the Arts that gave the first grant to buy the video exhibition equipment. And that was in, I think, 1973. So that's what really got the ball rolling. But the New York State Council, it was a woman who was the head of the media program and was very like, ugh, to MoMA and me.
That's a shame. That's a shame. Well, all I remember from that period about those two large funders was that for artists, we showed in museums before we showed in galleries. I mean, it was the opposite from painting, let's say, or sculpture, where you had a gallery and then you'd make it into the museum if you were lucky. We'd show in these, and maybe I'm thinking mainly of the Whitney program, not MoMA's at that early stage, but you could show an installation at the Whitney, and you would not be in a gallery. So it didn't feel like the same sort of commercial, capital-driven system that was propelling painting and sculpture at the time.
Interesting.
But the capital drive came when equipment became more friendly, when then dealers, a handful of them, realized somewhere in the late 80s, early 90s that yes, we can do editions, a few of them started to figure out how to market. So that's when the tide shifted.
That was in the 80s though, by that time, 80s, 90s. I mean, in the 70s, it was wide open, I felt.
Oh, of course.
Anyway, and I think all the other artists did as well. We felt, and particularly women, we felt we have a chance here. We have a chance to make a name. We have a chance to create a history. It's a living organism that is going to grow with us. And a Porta-Pack cost, I don't know, $1,500 at the most. So my husband at that time, Alvin Lucier, bought me a Porta-Pack, and I worked with that for, I don't know, 10 years maybe, something like that. And gradually, you're right, the equipment got, first the equipment got more expensive because the whole demands of television were something called broadcast standard, which was a real bugaboo in many ways. And then eventually the so-called broadcast standards and the portable usable artist equipment kind of caught up with each other in more recent times. And now that everything is digital and you can shoot video on your cell phone, and it's brilliant compared to what we shot in 1972, you know, there's now a whole other revolution taking place, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, if you look at the news, I remember it was rare for television to put anything that an independent artist made up on to broadcast, and that was the public television's Artist TV Labs. There was one in San Francisco, one in Boston, and one in New York. But I remember the documentarian John Alpert getting into the PBS, system and making documentaries, whether that was in Cuba or that was about, Third Avenue or whatever he was doing. But it's ironic that the artists were closed out as documentary makers in the 70s, but now on our news today, if you look at the news, everything is shot, they're all putting up Zooms up on the screen, in the evening news. That would never, ever have happened.
No. Well, the first people it was not the Maisels. There was a pair of brothers, or a brother, a wife and a husband team who did this.
The Marpettes, Bill and Esty Marpet?
No, it was
Susan and Alan Raymond.
Susan and Alan Raymond. And they put something, there was a documentary that was done on television that was totally grainy black and white video, like what we were using. That was a major breakthrough, actually.
And that was PBS. And that was PBS.
Of course, it was PBS. And I had work shown on PBS as early as 1983, but not before then. And that was the new television program at Channel 13 and in Boston and at WETA in Washington. And those pieces circulated around the country and were shown as at 11:30 at night, of course. It was their timing. But that was also quite a step forward, I thought, if you were interested in that single channel medium. Documentary, however, has come a long way since then. Because for a while, documentary was very much out of the picture. Installation was taking over. And now documentary is back with a huge force because it is so relevant to talk about our times in documentary ways.
Absolutely. Mary, and you contributed work this week to our exhibition, How Can You Think About Art at a Time Like This? Do you want to speak a little bit about Leaving Earth and the piece that you contributed?
Sure. Leaving Earth is a title drawn from my late husband. I hope I can talk about this. Lisa, you understand what I'm going through. Anyway, it's very difficult.
All right. Do you want us to move on to something else?
No, I think I could talk about it. I'll look out the window. Leaving Earth is based on a text that my husband, Bob Berlin, wrote in his final year as he was dying. And I use it as a jumping off point because it's rather journalistic. It's not a formal text. He was a great writer. He was a critic. He was a painter, an intellectual. But this is a very simple sort of a diaristic set of entries that he wrote about his approaching death because he knew he was dying from the minute he was diagnosed. So that experience has had a huge impact, obviously. And what I want to say about it is that it brings to mind how do people deal with end-of-life issues in their various ways, and how can I use the jumping off point of his final text to reflect on these issues in a more general way, not in a morbid way, not in a sentimental way, but in a way that will engage other people who might not otherwise talk or think about these things. And we're all getting older, right? I mean, end of life is approaching for all of us. So I decided to take this step, and it's extremely difficult. Because I want to make an installation of it. And I also would like to do a single channel, more filmic sort of single piece. So it involves both my response, his reaction to his own dying, his wisdom about dying, and other people as well, whose experiences I'm also going to tap into.
Yeah, it's an incredibly moving piece, and I really recommend everybody go to our website, find Mary Lucier's page, and on it is the video, and I really recommend seeing it.
It's a very short clip. I have a somewhat longer clip that's 5 minutes. The one you look at would be about 1.5 minutes. It's extremely short, but I thought I wouldn't belabor
It's
the
really effective.
Thank you.
Really effective.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When you guys were talking about the 70s and early 80s and the early part of the creation of video art, one thing that I know is really important to both of you is archiving. And, what do we do with a piece that was made on a Betacam, 30 years ago? How do we digitize work like that? Or does that change the piece? What have you decided?
Well, there are many, many issues involved with that question. And hopefully whatever work is under consideration, the artist is still there. Or if a museum or a collector has acquired the piece, that they had the smarts at the time of the acquisition to sit down with the artist and say, what is your artistic vision? What is crucial to this artwork. What does it need? Does it need if it's a projection, what's the luminance, how big, what's the audio, not is it loud, but very, very specifics. So if you get down essentials, and if the artist says, then you can do this and that, or if the equipment or the archival file becomes corrupt, then hopefully the artist has a master, you go back, or with the artist, you then do the upgrade. So I think it's all revolving around the aesthetics of what the piece is. Then of course, I know Mary has a lot of things to say about this, because whether you're an individual, and I tell this to my students, and Mia knows that I've said this to them up at Columbia, I always say to students, you're the curator of your life. And if you don't take care of what you've made, nobody else is. And if you don't figure out what the software is and you do the upgrading, nobody else is. Or how is somebody going to be able to take care of that? And when the piece comes into a collection, then what are the digital files? How do you upgrade? Is it off the shelf software? Is it, so you've got all of these issues. And thank goodness now there are young specialists who have gone through the NYU and other programs about conservation. And they have this knowledge, as does it exist on the website of Matters in Media Art and Electronic Arts Intermix. So it's a big handful. And hopefully, the institution, and like a MoMA, also has the ephemera. And I always would say the books are so important. And with Mia yesterday with the review, Terry Fox's name came up. And I know Kathy Ray knows Terry Fox quite well. But that's somebody who was prolific and worked across all kinds of mediums, but yet there's a lot of books and a lot of interviews. So you've got to go back to what the artist's voice was. So that's crucial.
Mary, I know you've been deeply engaged in this issue.
Well, I've been working with an archivist, a young man named Nicholas Carbone, for the last year. And he's 28 years old and he's well educated. He has a degree in archiving and conservation, and that's what he does. So we are going through all of my media. He is cataloging everything. He describes it. I have spreadsheets you wouldn't believe that describe everything about a tape. And what eventually we're aiming to do is to digitize all of this material, to bring it into the 21st century, which I've already done with several pieces. I did it with Equinox, which was shown at MIT, in the Columbus Museum, and at Sculpture Center. I digitized that myself, and that was a sort of ragtag job, but it turned out beautifully. And now we're working with the NYU MEOP class to digitize a piece from 1977 called Paris Dawnburn, which is a 7-channel black and white piece shot on both NTSC and PAL mediums in half-inch open reel tape. So what I want to say though about it's everything that Barbara said, and it involves not only all my media, it involves all my paper files, it involves my blueprints, it involves my flat files, it involves all my photographs, my vast accumulation of correspondence over the year, you name it. But what interests me most is that taking this long look backwards now gives me material for the future. Because how does an artist filmmaker usually proceed? You have to have funding, you have to have a crew, you often have actors, and you proceed into the world, you go to locations. So these are things we can't do now. So one can use your archive as a creative resource for contemporary work if you've saved everything. And that's something else then that I'm involved in doing, both in a new collaboration with Elizabeth Streb, the choreographer I've worked with many times before, and with this piece based on my husband's text, in which I am using material that I shot over the past 10 years. And having it all available on hard drives in digital format makes it usable to me and makes me able to craft something that is contemporary and new out of material that's old.
Interesting.
Interesting.
And you both have done a magnificent job in developing your websites going back decades so that we can follow the whole progress of this. Um, if you
That was
take the time.
terribly important. Terribly. To me, that website is like a catalog raisonné. You know, I mean, it's really crucial that everything gets in, even if everything isn't entirely explained in text, that's least represented.
Yeah. Yeah, you've done an incredible job. We loved looking at all of it. Barbara, I wanted to ask you about a question about curating video art, and what is the curatorial criteria around video art? Is it different from other medias, or is it?
That's a hard question because I think video is as diverse as painting or sculpture. You know, there are so many different approaches. So in the very beginning, I used to say that I was very, in quote, Catholic, meaning that I was very open and that I didn't want to have blinders. And I was very fortunate that at MoMA, I was doing thematic shows. And, you know, now if I told you some of the titles, they sound kind of dorky, but it was like, I was interested in narrative, or I was interested in, I wanted to know more about image processing. So I wanted to know about the technology, the tools. I wanted to know about the creative process. Then, you know, then you work into form, and then you work into theory, and then you work into, you know, lots of different things. And of course, from the very beginning, there were very strong social issues. It's great that Franklin Furnace is the host for your fundraising, because they've been very, I would say they've not had a political agenda, but a very strong political and social awareness. So, you know, and then if an artist would come into me and say, how come you're not showing my work? I'd say, well, I'm one individual, I'm one institution, I'm trying to do the best I can, but of course there are other people in New York. There was Kathy Ray in California, and then she was up in Boston at the ICA, or I would say, you know, they have other points of view, so you can't just count on me. And if you think I'm a closed door, you know, there are other doors, and maybe my door will open later. So the curating, and then it's got many different formats and many forms. So yes, it's single channel, yes, it's installation. And from the very beginning, I was very interested in sound because I knew Namjoon had played the piano, Bill Viola had played the drums, or James Nares was in a punk band, or John Jonas collaborated with James, or I knew that there were all these crossovers. And so I made it my business to go to Max's Kansas City, to go to these music events, to travel, to go and try to get from the horse's mouth what was happening, so that I could distill and then bring it into MoMA, which was multidisciplinary. So that's how I approached it.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit about your global vision? I know that you went to Japan very early on. We spoke a little bit about that yesterday.
Well, at MoMA, was very fortunate. I had a lot of opportunity, and MoMA is international. And as I watched the contemporary curators go to Europe, I did that, but I thought a lot about where this technology then was coming from. And Sony and Matsushita were Japanese corporations, and Mary and a lot of other of my artist friends were having these a Sony camera or a Sony, you know, 3/4 inch deck or whatever. So I thought, well, what are Japanese artists doing? So I was lucky to get a grant to go, and the grant was $5,000. With that, I got to Japan, I selected work, I came back, I produced a catalog, and then I put the show on the road to 12 other museums. So it was all me, with working with Bill Viola's then girlfriend, who typed the catalog, you know. So anyway, I figured out how to be enterprising and just to do. So that was Japan. So that opened up my big interest in Asia. Then I got into Korea. Then I got into China in the 80s, and then decided I wanted to go to China in the 90s to see what was happening because my European curatorial colleagues were telling me about Japanese, Chinese video. So I got a travel grant and then decided any curator, whether you're at MoMA or Boston or wherever, you have to go through checks and balances to get a show in the building. So I thought, well, I want to put that information up online as I was doing it, finding it day by day. And that became, with a very modest grant, what I called my curatorial dispatches. It was pre-blog. So that's indeed how I started in Asia, and then it grew and grew. So I've continued, I've continued with my interests internationally, so.
Yeah, it was definitely got me to China, your posts from China. I think will be the last question we'll ask you so that it's time for audience questions. But Anne and I are really wondering, because we're showing so many video artists on our site, how this migration to digital platforms that museums are doing, that galleries are doing, is going to impact video art. I mean, both of you are quite committed to video installation. What happens when everything moves to the computer?
Well, let me just speak up. I have a very dear friend who I think is one of the very best, what we call single channel video artists. She refers to her works as films. Her name is Cecilia Condit. She makes—
right there on the screen.
Cecilia, are you there?
She's
She
there.
does brilliant video, single video pieces. Now these pieces, she has an advantage over those of us who say do installation. And this is not about being digital or not digital, but it does in the long run have something to do with that, because she is able to distribute her work to film festivals, even now, who have gone online. She probably has as much work now as she's had in years, more work. So it's very interesting to be able to see that happening, that those of us who are committed to installation, which is so physical, so three-dimensional, so bulky in some ways it's not, if it's just projection, but how we require space, and therefore we require maybe a building, or we require a gallery, or require a room. And those people who are working purely digitally can still produce their work and send it out through other channels. And I think this has been a big awakening for me, because I am so accustomed, I come out of sculpture, and I'm so accustomed to wanting to work three-dimensionally. So I'm interested in reconsidering all of these issues. I think that what's happened in the larger picture is that once the moving image became digital, there's really hardly any distinction between film and video anymore. I mean, Martin Scorsese made his last film entirely digitally. Is that video art? No, it's filmmaking, because he's a filmmaker. But I still like to use the term video, even though I think it has essentially lost its meaning because it is now digital. So film and video have kind of merged in this digital era, which makes it more mobile. I mean, Scorsese premiered his film on Netflix. You didn't have to go to a theater to see it. So those are just indications, I think, of where it's going. It's no definitive statement, but I think the indications are that now that it's digital, it's much more mobile.
So I think I like to now use the term media art, and video is under that umbrella to me of media art. So it could be single channel, it could be installation. And I never forget sound, because sound is 50% of any moving image. I'm fascinated. I keep my ear to the ground. I am an advisor for a PhD coming out of University of Pittsburgh, and it's a young woman who is doing her PhD on Chinese video. So she's introduced me to the very, very young and very enterprising, very amazing. And they do both. They do installation, but there's brilliant single channel. And that could be, like, I know Cecilia is very involved with TikTok. So, you know, all of these new methods, it's all valid, it's all viable. And I think that's why I teach. I want to know what young people are thinking and what they're up to and how they're using these tools, because I say to them, this is your generation's tools. It's not mine. I'm old, and I want to learn. I teach you, but you teach me. And I'm very grateful that I try to keep up that way.
Great.
Yeah. Um, we would like to ask also some questions from our audience. So if you have any questions, please use chat feature. It's at the bottom of your screen. If you just hover your mouse over the bottom, there's a chat function where you can chat. But I found it very interesting what you said, Mary, about installation and video. And obviously when you create your work and installations, you have some sort of agency over how people view your work. Have you thought about how you could kind of manipulate how people can view your work from home if they were to see it digitally? Like
That is a very interesting question. I remember very well back in the 80s when I was collaborating with the choreographer Elizabeth Streb, and we had done a piece that Channel 13 in New York, WNET, PBS, was going to show on television. And I was so fanatical about how the monitor looked. In an installation, I'd spend so much of my time tuning the monitors. And I remember Elizabeth said to me, no, Mary, you cannot go to every household in New York tuning the monitors. And so it raises huge questions. I think you have to give up a certain amount of control. And to this, I would yield to Cecilia Condit, who is having this experience daily now. Her work is going out to film festivals that are online. And she doesn't worry about controlling the ambiance or the setting. She also has done installations, but I find that you cannot, there's a certain amount of control you have to relinquish. You have to be willing to relinquish it. And as I said before, Martin Scorsese was willing to release The Irishman on Netflix. He was willing to forego the huge screen in favor of a screen this size. So it's a remarkable, it's a lesson. And it's something we all have to chew on and decide what is the future exactly of this moving image medium.
Well, I want to make a point that Peter Campus was making very interesting installations using a very simple camera way back in the 70s. And there was a moment when he stopped making these installations because he found that curators, not Momo ones or not Whitney ones, but there were curators out there who would not take care of the little light bulb, or would not, if the camera got knocked over there by somebody in the public, then it was not the piece. So he had no control, because the museum, the institution, was not taking care. So he stopped making installations, and then 20 plus years later, he returned and he's making work that's on a flat screen. So yeah, these are all decisions and aesthetic decisions that you make as tools upgrade and change, and the world changes.
Yeah,
the politics change.
But it's almost as like giving an instruction to the next, where your artwork travels to, when you provide a certain instruction of installation. It's almost as if you could give that to the audience.
That's very
But I think what Mary did with a very early installation, it was meant to have like sculptural, pedestals and very particular monitors. And then at a point she said, if this is going to live, I have to really rethink this piece.
Well, one thing I find, I spend a lot of time making manuals for all my works. They could be 30 or 50 pages long. They include diagrams, they include specs, they include how things are set up, they include floor plans. It's just elaborate, and that has to do with installation. I also have some very interesting news that installation, I think the one you're talking about, Barbara, was called Wilderness. That was 1989, was sold to a Finnish collector who then died.
Oh dear.
And I thought the piece was lost forever. And I remember Donna DeSalvo was helping me try to find it. We couldn't find it. And I thought, well, it's been sold off piece by piece. Turns out another Finnish collector retrieved it. And it still exists.
Good.
It's
Oh, good.
original 1989 format. So this is off on a different subject, but what I'm going to eventually be doing with him is resuscitating that work as it was for his use in his home. So sometimes things can come back as they were. And then sometimes you have to project into the future and create a different kind of medium if it's your ideas that are important and your images that are important, and maybe not the surround so much, but the content.
Yeah.
We have a few questions. One person asked the question that liked the way that photography challenged painting, which I'm not so sure. How does video art challenge other mediums? Did it have an impact on other mediums?
Well, let's ask Peter Coyne that question, or right?
To ask what?
So
Well,
Peter Coyne, who's in the audience, she's a sculptor.
but I think
Worked for a long time.
But I think museums have changed, and museums changed along as video was changing. I would always be aware, even in the beginning, in the 70s and the 80s, a moving image is very attractive, very alluring. A very glowing video image pulls people in. And when I did one of the shows called Music Video of the Industry and Its Fringes, or another one, it got huge crowds because I was really looking at, you know, collaboration between music and visual artists and whatever. But I think it became very appealing and challenged the traditional painting and sculpture in some ways. And now we have dance and everything else in museums, and it remains to be seen now how after the virus and the lockdown and the recalibration of our public institutions, how all of this plays out.
There was a final comment that I think I'll share, that Ed Winkleman says, it feels like there's a built-in paradox to how accessible media technology is and how that encourages younger artists to experiment with it, but they don't give a thought to conservation.
But they don't what?
But they don't really think about conservation.
Who doesn't? The younger ones?
Younger generation. Do you think you can keep the kind of freewheeling, experimental atmosphere you had when you were coming up? Can younger artists keep that if they have to be worried about archiving?
Or if they have to be worried about money.
Yeah.
Or, but I think just as all of the galleries who have their doors shut also have figured out to put the moving image up and to say, okay, this week we're showing this video or this film, or we're doing this performance, or we're doing this music. I think, yeah, these are the tools of the younger generation, and they're going to find other ways. We're going to be surprised, and I look forward to that. If somebody says to me they're making this and they say I'm an artist, it's like I learned that very early at MoMA. You don't challenge them. They're an artist. If they say they're an artist, they're an artist. If you like it, you like it. And if you don't like it, or you find problem with it, but you show it or you don't show it. But it's viable. The energy is strong.
Yes. And so you sound very optimistic, and I wonder if Mary is as optimistic.
That's my nature.
Of the future of video art.
Well, optimism in a way doesn't have anything to do with it for me. I am concerned about very physical issues. I'm concerned about aging. I am obviously concerned about preservation, conservation, renovation of work. I think that I have come to a point where there's a divide now between the past and the future. And in that divide, as I told you before, I proceed by using what I have generated in the past is how I proceed to the future. In other words, I have to take steps through my past up towards the future and to see what it holds, because I can't make predictions. I absolutely can. One of the worst things you can do is to make a prediction. I mean, future predictions are always useless. And I agree with Barbara that the youth of today we were the youth once ourselves, and we determined this whole 50 years of video art. Now this new generations will determine the next 50 years. So, and there's no way to predict it, and we won't be here to see much of it. So, I don't know what I'm saying. I'm just saying that.
You're saying brilliant things.
I feel as though I'm stumbling along trying to just describe my own path. And my own path is totally distinct to me, and I don't expect anybody else to take it as a model. I am grateful for the people that I work with. I'm grateful to my archivist. I am grateful to everyone who I've ever edited with, everyone who's ever shot with me. Those people have all had input into what I was able to do. And, you know, you have to keep looking for new people like that. I mean, as I said, my archivist is 28 years old. He's extremely well trained. He could be 58 years old and he'd be the same, you know, but he's brilliant. So you put your faith in people like that as you move forward, but you bring what you know from your past. You have to do that too.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you very much, Mary Lucier. It was very generous of you to come here today, and I'm sure the whole audience enjoyed you.
But I think what you both, Anna and Barbara, have done is this is a community. There on screen are wonderful people, very creative people, very thoughtful people. And I think that's what's kept Mary and me very engaged with video, because it's a community also. So anyway.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
All right,
Thank
thank
you.
you everyone for joining us, and I hope that you guys will join us next week. And Mary and Barbara, thanks again. It was such a
Thank you.
pleasure having you guys and being able to listen
Thanks
to
for
you.
inviting us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.